Okay, so I want to start. This is the first time I've explained it this way, but this is how I comprehended it. This is how it made sense to me. So I'm going to try this. I'm showing you a visualization of a pathway in the brain. Okay, and then you're going to see this again in a few slides. So we're going to start with the pathways, not with the neurons. I want you to visualize in your brain, or in your mind, that your brain consists of pathways. And for all intents and purposes, let's call them circuits. This is a circuit in your brain. So the first thing I want to teach you is this. Your brain communicates in a way that's referred to as electrochemical. Electrochemical. Your body only communicates in chemicals. We call them hormones. Whatever's in your bloodstream cycles through your vascular system at whatever rate that the heart is pumping blood. So as your heart rate increases, the circulation of blood through your vascular system increases, and the molecules that are in your bloodstream get where they're going at a faster rate of time. In your brain, it's much, 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 much faster than that. So let's say, for instance, the way your body communicates hormonally, if you eat an apple and it's got like glucose in it, well, your gut has to digest that, and it has to absorb the nutrients into the bloodstream from the lining of your stomach, and then they have to circulate through your body and affect the body that way, and then whatever excess gets metabolized as waste and leaves the body. If that's the way your thoughts worked or your emotions worked, it would take you 20 minutes to realize that you saw something. So your brain does not communicate at the same slow pace that your body does. The hormonal chemical process is super slow. But the electrochemical process is really quick. Your brain communicates at a much faster rate than your body does. It's electrochemical. It takes about 0.2 of a second for a message to travel your whole brain. That's actually fairly slow by standards of what we know to be true, like the speed of sound and the speed of light. But it's much faster than your bloodstream. If you have a headache and you take headache medication, the pills have to dissolve, whatever active molecule has to be absorbed into the blood, and then it has to circulate into your brain, and it has to affect the brain however it affects the brain. It's a slow process. Hormonal processes are very slow. They take a while to kick in, and they take a while to wear off. But your brain does not communicate at a slow rate. Your brain communicates at a very, 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 very fast rate. So that's where we're starting. The fact that this is electrochemical communication. The electro part is what causes the neuron to fire. It's a static electrical pulse. It's a change in ionization that we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute. The electrical side of things is a static charge. Right? So the electro part refers to causing a neuron to release its molecules, causing a neuron to fire. Let's use that analogy. The chemical part is the fact that how your neurons communicate with each other is that they release molecules, they release chemicals. And that's what causes the static charge to continue. So these are pathways in your brain. Like I said, for all intents and purposes, let's call them a circuit. If this were a bunch of extension cords that were all plugged into each other, they still have to be plugged into an electrical source, right? But if you unplug one of the extension cords, the current dies, right? It stops. It only goes as far as the connection. Your brain is the same way. It doesn't matter that you have billions of neurons. It matters that your billions of neurons are connected together at some point. It's a chain of communication. It's a chain of static electricity. So when you visualize, this is what's known as the serotonin pathway in the brain. Serotonin is a molecule that only has one purpose. It determines your mood. So the serotonin pathway is the messages that travel throughout your brain. And notice it goes through most of your limbic system in the center of your brain. It also goes out, branches out. Look at where all these neurons go. Serotonin branches out into parts of the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe. Serotonin travels throughout a lot more of the brain's surface area than dopamine does. So here's where we have to make a distinguishment right off the bat. I've not done a good job of this in the past, so you guys are benefiting from this. A lot of my students have previously believed, because I'm going to show you a diagram of neurons, that every neuron has every molecule in it and just releases them at different times. That's not correct. There are specific neuron pathways that release and produce specific molecules, and they have a specific effect on the body. So for instance, before we even look at a neuron, this chain of neurons right here, every one of those neurons in the pathway is a little factory that manufactures serotonin. And it releases that serotonin when a charge goes through the neuron itself. And it's a chain reaction. Serotonin molecules are not traveling from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Serotonin molecules are being released by one, received by the other, and then released back. And each one of the dominoes in the chain produces its own serotonin, stores its own serotonin, and releases its own serotonin, and then reabsorbs it back for later use. Right? So that's how the pathway works. If you visualize not just one neuron, but a whole chain of neurons in a pathway. And as long as the message is firing throughout the brain, each one of these neurons in its turn is releasing its serotonin, which is being received by the next neuron, which changes the polarization, which causes that neuron to release its serotonin, which is received by the next one, and it goes so on and so forth and so on and so. So imagine an electrical circuit. It's a good analogy, but how the electrical circuit works is it's a chain reaction of like electric shocks. You shock the neuron and it releases its contents, and those contents get absorbed, and it causes a static charge, and that shocks the neuron and it releases its contents, and so on and so forth down the chain. Your thoughts are no different. Your memories are no different. But I want to start with serotonin and dopamine because that's a little bit more visual. The serotonin pathway is what mood you are in. So if your brain does not produce, if your neurons don't produce enough serotonin, that's a chemical imbalance that we call what? It starts with a D. Depression. The chemical explanation for depression is that your brain serotonin pathway is intact. You can receive and produce serotonin, but you don't produce enough. So the level of serotonin that your brain is perceiving is not enough to keep you feeling normal. It's definitely not enough to make you happy. And if you have too much serotonin in the brain, you're so happy that we get what's called mania. You become manic. And the opposite of mania is depression. So some people's serotonin systems are so irregular and so erratic that they spike from mania back down to depression, spike to mania, back down to depression. Polar opposites in emotions. And what do we call that psychological disorder? Bipolar. Bipolar 1 and there's bipolar 2. And that's chemically what's happening in the brain of someone who suffers from bipolar disorder. The serotonin pathway is erratic. Sometimes it produces too much serotonin and it doesn't release it. Sometimes it releases too much serotonin and it stops producing it because it thinks there is too much. It can't regulate an appropriate level of serotonin to feel normal. That's what bipolar is. Yes, Jake? Well, the problem with mania is not in the... That's a good question. The problem is not that mania is problematic as an emotion. It's problematic as your homeostatic state of emotion. Does that make sense? Well, so the issue with mania is that it's a very irrational level of contentment, right? Almost to the point of sociopathy. So you are so manically content that even something that should be emotionally triggering does not affect you at all. So think like the Joker, right? So what happens is you're in a manic state and you actually enjoy the suffering of other people because you are just so chemically happy that your brain is not rational. Most people's serotonin levels drop when they witness something that makes them sad. A manic episode, you would not. So you don't have an appropriate response to the emotional stimuli of the world. That's one problem with mania. The other problem is it burns a lot of energy. Being manic is a high emotional state. So if you stay in a manic state long enough, you're going to burn too much energy. And that's how your brain keeps itself balanced. Burst of energy, and then we calm, right? So we're up and we're down. That's what homeostasis is. Too much of a chemical, we need to counteract it with this chemical, and that chemical gets metabolized and it leaves the body. But if you put a synthetic chemical, like say you just keep putting caffeine into your bloodstream and it keeps affecting the brain, well, the brain can't regulate itself. You're regulating it artificially. So so introducing a drug into the brain is very similar to, say, something like a psychological disorder. If I'm manic all the time, am I really manic? No. I just require a lot of serotonin to feel normal. And so if I drop a little bit, because somebody asked me last week, well, why doesn't everybody take antidepressants? What antidepressants are, they're called SSRIs. They're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And you'll learn what reuptake is, where I'm getting ahead of the game. But basically, it increases the amount of serotonin that stays in your brain. If you were to take an SSRI as a non-depressed person, a non-clinically depressed person, all you're doing is convincing your brain's homeostatic state that this is normal for me, which means that you're going to have to stay at that level of serotonin to feel normal. And when you drop back down to your original normal, it's actually going to be depression. So that's the problem. If you manipulate your chemicals that are normally functioning, I'll say, your balanced chemistry. If you chemically imbalance your chemistry, you're messing with your brain's ability to keep you in homeostasis. Some people don't produce enough serotonin. So without medication, they would stay in a constant state of depression. They have to take antidepressants because that's going to bring them, not make them happy and oblivious to the problems of the world. They need enough serotonin to feel normal so that they can process emotions. Right? Say that again. You can, but here's the problem with depression compared to, say, anxiety. Anxiety is a cognitive disorder. Depression is a chemical disorder. So with anxiety, you can some thought process is triggering a stress response. So you can learn to separate the thought from the emotion. With depression, it's a chemical imbalance. It's not logical. You can have therapy, and maybe in a therapy session you can learn like, oh, this is not rational. But the problem is that I still feel really sad. And you may not even feel sad. You may just feel worthless. And it's not logical. That's the thing about depression and suicide. That people who have functional brains have a hard time understanding suicidal ideation because it's not a logical thought process that causes someone to attempt suicide. It's a chemical imbalance in the brain. Their brain is not well. They need an increase in serotonin to feel normal. They are in this constant state of despair. They don't value themselves. They have no self-esteem. They have a low sense of worth, and they're in pain. And most people who are suicidal, they don't want to die. What is it that they want? They want the pain to end. They want the pain to stop. And so they are irrationally, chemically imbalanced. And luckily, we have medication. So there are two biological disorders that are chemical imbalances in the brain. There are other chemical imbalances, but they are nurtured. So there are two genetically inherited disorders that you can get through no fault of your upbringing or culture. One is schizophrenia, and the other is depression. So depression is not, our logical brain says, well, that person had everything going for them. Why would they? You can just be genetically depressed. It doesn't have to be life trauma, right? So that's a good question that you asked. Now, life trauma can make you depressed if your outlook on life is affected. That's psychological. You can get therapy for like PTSD or learned helplessness, like if you were the victim of assault or something like that, right? But if you are chemically incapable of producing enough serotonin to circulate in your brain, you are biologically incapable of feeling normal, right? And that's where this mental health awareness is important. Understand what depression is. Depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain. It's not people being soft, right? It's their brain is incapable of producing enough serotonin to keep them at a normal state. Yes.
If you are genetically affected by depression, that therapy can help that?
Well, it could help you understand your condition, but the problem with emotions are the emotions of how we feel, especially in a deep state of despair. It's really hard to logically, because again, here's why your question is important. it's the wrong question, because we are thinking we are happy because we think happy. That's not the case. We are happy because our brain has serotonin circulating through it. If we were to deplete our level of serotonin, there's no logical thought that can make us happy. We are chemically incapable of being happy, right? That's the answer to that. So my advice to anyone who suffers from bouts with depression, you need to get on medication before you start getting into therapy. And therapy will help you cope with the world, don't get me wrong. But sometimes it's appropriate to balance your chemistry. It's not always appropriate. I'm not a fan of anti-anxiety medications. I'm not. And that's not, don't at me. I know some people are debilitatingly panicked. But I am very much a proponent of your brain does not produce enough serotonin. You need to take an SSRI to be okay. And then you can therapeutically hopefully get to the point where your brain, because keep in mind, as a teenager, if you're fighting with depression, you're either in puberty or just out of puberty. So your homeostasis is probably not static yet. It's probably kind of plastic. Your brain is figuring everything out. Hormonal changes have changed the chemistry in your brain. So it may be true that suffering from depression at 17 doesn't mean that you'll suffer from depression at 27. So you might have to just medicate in the lowest dosage possible, according to what your psychiatrist says, enough to get you to a state where your brain has balanced itself out, if that makes sense. You just have it. It just doesn't show symptoms until... Schizophrenia is, well, I can't say this definitively, but brain scans show that there is missing brain tissue in people who have schizophrenic delusions or hallucinations. And so the theory is that part of the brain that's missing is probably what controls your grasp on reality. So schizophrenia is almost like, there are 5 different types of schizophrenia, but most people think, when they think of schizophrenia, they're thinking of paranoid schizophrenia, where you see things or hear things or believe things that aren't rational. So if you believe, that you're a secret Russian spy and the government is trying to kill you, it doesn't matter what evidence suggests, because that belief in you is real. So this is let me preface this by saying this is not an exact, I don't want to reduce this to this. So some people will be very triggered if I reduce schizophrenia to this. But just so you understand, until we actually explain in depth what it is, essentially, to imagine what schizophrenia is, it is your brain's lack of ability to differentiate reality from fantasy, is what it is, in some specific way. So it's much more complicated than that. I don't want anybody who has a family member who deals with schizophrenia to think it's just that simple. But that's like a placeholder until we get to schizophrenia. It's basically people who have the inability to differentiate reality from the truth in very specific ways. And no, you can't really give yourself schizophrenia. You just kind of are genetically prone to schizophrenia or not. Most people are not, luckily. So, now that we imagine pathways, it's a chain of communication. Let's zoom way in. We're going to zoom. Now, this will make more sense when you learn what dopamine does. We just explained what serotonin does. But when you learn what dopamine does in the brain, you'll know this is the part of the brain where dopamine is being produced, it's being released, and it's being received. The same thing is true with serotonin. So this is not a thought. This is a chemical, electric chain of communication. Let's imagine this were a thought. If we broke the chain of communication, that memory would be gone forever. All right, that's what Alzheimer's is. So let's get into the neuron itself. I'm going to preview the vocab, and then I'm going to show you on a chart what the parts of the neuron are. So we're going to talk about what a neuron is. That's the first vocab word. There are 3 different types of neurons, neuron systems. You have brain neurons. Those are interneurons. You have sensory neurons. That's from the 5 senses bringing messages to the brain. And you have motor neurons. Those are messages coming from the brain to the body. So a motor neuron would be like a neuron that's in your arm, it's in your leg, it's in your skin cells. That's a motor neuron. Sensory neuron would be something that sends a message to the brain. So you might have a motor pathway to move your finger, but you also have a pain pathway in your finger. So if you cut your finger, a pain message is going to the brain from the finger. So that's important to know because every neuro pathway is one direction. One direction, Niall, right? One direction. So that's what happens. They don't go back and forth. A message originates, a static charge changes the ionization, and it travels dominoes down the pathway. So that's what happens. If you cut your arm, that signal sends a chain reaction of neurons up to the brain, right? So we'll get to that in just a second. Let's start with the parts of a neuron. A neuron has a couple different parts, and you're going to see them visually on the screen. It has dendrites, and I'm going to use the analogy of a palm tree in just a second. It might make more sense if you're visual. There's an axon, the cable, the actual part of the neuron that the message travels down. There is the myelin that insulates the axon, keeps the current insulated. There are the branches that send out or release the molecules. The synapse, which is the space between one neuron and the other neuron. There's the cell body of the neuron, which is where the nucleus is. And so now let's get into more detail about all that, because you're going to define these words and you're going to study the vocab, but if you can visualize it in your brain, it might make more sense. So let's look at it. This is a good slide if you just wanted to print one slide out from the presentation and put it in your notes. For full disclosure, there are different shapes and sizes of neurons. Motor neurons have a different order, sensory neurons have a different order, and there's different types of neurons inside of your brain. This is probably more like a neuron that's in your body than the neuron that's in your brain. The neuron that's in your brain might have the cell body in the middle and multiple axon cables going out. That's because it's connected to different places. But this is the most visually satisfying, easy to understand neuron. This is like, imagine this is one of the nerves in your thigh, right? So if you were to imagine, if we flipped this on its head, if we rotated this image, imagine it's not a neuron, but imagine it's a tree. And we know below the soil line, we have the roots of the tree. And what is the purpose for the roots on any plant? What do the roots do? They gather nutrients. They are the receivers of the plant, right? That's what the dendrites do on a neuron. Notice there's significantly more bushy branching dendrites than there are terminals. Like a battery has a positive end, which is the terminal, and it has a negative end. The dendrites, in our analogy here, are the roots that are below the surface, and they have the same function. They reach out in all directions, but instead of gathering nutrients from water, they're going to gather molecules that are bouncing around. So let's say this is one of these serotonin neurons. Then what these dendrites are doing is they're branching out in all directions, trying to catch whatever molecules are bouncing around. Now, there might be more molecules than just serotonin. But if this is a serotonin neuron, it's going to have a really specifically shaped receptor site. So that when a really specific serotonin molecule lands on the receptor site, it causes a reaction. So each one of these arms on the dendrites have receptor sites on them. And what they do is they fit like a lock and a key with a specific molecule. And if serotonin molecules are bouncing around and they land, it's going to cause an actual reaction. And if enough molecules land on enough receptor sites, on enough of the dendrites, it's actually going to change the polarization of the neuron itself. So imagine like static electricity. What if you get positive ion, positive ion, positive ion, positive ion, and enough positives, it's going to cause a static charge. So what happens is this, it's real simple. A molecule lands on a receptor site on the dendrite. If enough receptor sites are activated, the cell body changes polarization, which causes a charge to travel down the axon. And when that static charge gets to the terminals, it causes them to release their molecules. And the process repeats itself. And as their molecules bounce around, and if they land on the dendrites of another neuron, and they fit into a receptor site, it causes a reaction. So, if you want to increase the likelihood that a neuron fires, you have to increase the amount of molecules in the synapse bouncing around. So let's say you drink coffee and you have caffeine in your bloodstream. What caffeine does is it mimics a molecule in your brain. It's a molecule that's called adenosine. And what adenosine does is it prevents your brain from using up all of its energy reserves. So essentially what caffeine does is it mimics the molecule in the brain, lands on receptor sites, and it blocks another molecule. So your brain essentially has lost the ability to reserve its energy and spread it out over the day. So instead, you have full access to your energy. And you burn it up too quickly, and what happens to you? You crash. So your brain knows I have X amount of calories and X amount of energy reserves to use throughout the day. And if you put a chemical into your bloodstream like caffeine, it blocks the brain's ability to regulate itself. And you have full access to all of your energy for that day. And you use it up in first period, and then you crash. So caffeine works. It makes you more attentive. It makes you more alert. It decreases the likelihood that you're going to fall asleep. But the reason why you fall asleep is because the brain is trying to charge and have access to more energy over a longer period of time. So by preventing yourself from recharging the battery of your brain, you just use it up. And just like your cell phone, your brain goes in low power mode. And ironically, we drink caffeine to be alert during tests, but what happens is if your brain only has so much energy, it takes a lot of energy to keep you breathing. So the choice is simple. Do I pay attention to calculus, or do I keep this heart beating? And what do you think your brain decides to do? Keep your heart beating. So you may be more alert, but you may not be more attentive because your brain only has so much energy. In other words, caffeine is beneficial, but it doesn't take the place of sleep. If you have enough energy stored up and then you have access to it because you drank coffee, but your brain is not in low power mode, then you're in good shape. But if you're sleep deprived and you drink caffeine as a way to stay alert, it doesn't mean that you're consciously aware because your brain only has so much energy and it can't allow you to die. Right? All right, brain, keep me going for the next hour and then we can shut down the lungs and the heart for a couple hours. Okay, good. Here we go. Hope we do well on this quiz. Fingers crossed. No, your brain uses about 25% of the calories that you eat every single day. So if you don't sleep and you don't get enough good calories and you drink caffeine, you're not making yourself more accessible. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable. You're in low power mode. So caffeine doesn't take the place of sleep. We know that because of brain chemistry and how neurons work. You have to sleep. You have to eat. If you sleep and you eat and then you drink coffee, then you have access to more energy, but there's still going to be some left. So your brain doesn't have to choose between breathing and thinking. It does both, and then you crash a little bit still. So caffeine, it does help you stay focused and alert, but it doesn't take the place of sleeping because there's only so much energy you can use, right, before you shut down and die. So, but I digress. The dendrites are what receive the messages. And if you're visual and you like the tree metaphor, then go with that. These are the roots below the soil line, and all they're doing is reaching out. And roots grow because the bigger the roots are, the more access to surface area they have. So what causes long-term potentiation in the brain? Well, the more that you use a pathway in your brain, what happens to the dendrites? They begin to what? They actually physically grow longer. So neurons can increase in size. The axon doesn't get longer, the dendrites get longer, and they collide with the other neurons, and they connect with them. And that's when you have a permanent pathway. You don't have to think about it to retrieve the memory because the pathway is there, right? That's the way that you have to think about neurocommunication. So here's another good way to look at it. This is from your study guide. This is on your test. You don't grow new neurons. You're born with all the neurons you're ever going to have. The difference is when you're a baby, the dendrites have not grown to connect with other neurons, if that makes sense. So you don't build new neurons. What you do is grow the ones that you have. So there's a way to grow the dendrites in your brain. And that's what your parents probably did with you when you were like 4 in Montessori school. You were like flashcarding the alphabet. And you were practicing saying, that's a ball. And this is this color. that critical period for learning. That's because your dendrites are growing. The more you use your brain, the more the lightning strikes the antenna, the more likely those dendrites are going to grow. And if you don't use them, they atrophy and they die. And you learned that in the last chapter. What happens if you're 7 before you ever try to say your first words? It may not even be possible anymore because your brain has not used that pathway at all. And just like any plant or any organism, it has to be nourished to grow or it dies. So you can definitely kill your brain cells, but you can't grow new ones. So that's what you have to be careful of about at this stage of your life, is that you have dendrites that still need to connect together. And like the prefrontal cortex, your impulse control. And you're doing things like sniffing glue and like shotgunning beers, and that affects the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So not only are you limited in your decision making when it comes to controlling your impulses as it is, you're taking an agent that numbs the minimal amount of decision making that you have. And so horrendous things seem like good decisions to you. Again, it's not a lack of intelligence. That's not the part of your brain that's still growing. The part of your brain that's still growing dendrites is the impulse part of your brain, right? So you can kill those brain cells. If you drink too much, you will be stuck permanently in this state forever in your life. You'll be a really smart, really immature child, like man-child. You'll be the like 40-year-old who acts 17, and that's not cute at all. You say, how does that happen? Well, they drank themselves into that state, crushing beer cans against their frontal lobe as they pounded some alcohol and destroyed the only brain cells that hadn't connected yet. That's a biological fact. You have to be really careful. You're like the cake that's still doughy in the middle, like you're almost done, like the outside of you looks done, but it's still like you're still in the oven, right? You're still baking. Okay, that's a bad analogy because some of you are probably baking and that's not good for your brain, right? Stop baking because you're still baking, right? Your brain is still developing. That doesn't mean it won't at some point be a fully developed brain. It's not that alcohol is always going to have the same detrimental effect on your brain. It's that right now you're in a developmental period where alcohol does irreparable damage to the brain. It's not like once I metabolize the ACH, I'm good. I can remember. No. You killed the brain cells, moron. They don't grow back. Idiot. What are you doing? You can't, right? They turned out fine. No, they didn't. They're a hot mess. Look at them. Okay? Just because you're standing and can recite things doesn't mean you're fine, right? You have to be cognizant of what you're doing to your body at this stage in your life. Irreparable. That's the word I'm going to use. All right? Now, again, people think I'm going to be stupid. No, your intelligence is probably where it's going to be. But it's your impulse control, right? It's that part of your brain. The ability to make logical rather than emotional decisions. You get in bar fights when you're 32 years old, right? Interesting. Why does that happen? Because the emotional feeling is in the mammal brain, and the impulsive ability to not do that has been stunted by alcohol. Probably at that very moment. So, that's the dendrites. They actually physically grow. Neurons don't regenerate, the dendrites grow. And hopefully they collide with other dendrites or other neurons, I'll say. So let's say enough positive charges have happened. And they concentrate in the cell body. It's where the nucleus is. Then what happens is called an action potential. When you get enough of an ion, like an ionic charge, an ion change, then what happens is this current travels down the axon and it goes to the terminals. And let's say this metaphor. Let's say it shocks the terminals and causes them to release their molecules. And the process repeats itself. So this is important to know. It's not like you have only so much serotonin and that travels from one neuron to the next, to the next, to the next. No, each of your serotonin neurons creates its own serotonin and stores it in the terminals and then releases it and then reabsorbs it back for later use. So every neuron produces a molecule and is capable of releasing the molecules. And if they're connected with the dendrites of another neuron, once they release their molecules, they might cause a chain reaction, right? So it's a process. On the test, you're going to need to know, here's how the action potential works. It goes from the dendrites to the cell body, down the axon, and out through the terminals. Dendrites to cell body to axon. Every neuro pathway is a one-direction pathway. In other words, dendrites will always receive messages, and the little terminals at the end of the axon will always send messages. Dendrites listen, axons speak, right, from your study guide. So, the branches, dendro means branch, so you can visualize it's a branch, right? So we have the roots, they're receiving the messages, the nutrients in our metaphor. The axon, if we were following the metaphor of a tree, what would the axon be? What part of the tree? It would be the trunk, right? We absorb the nutrients in the roots. They travel up the trunk and to the branches, right? To the arms of the tree. So once we get a polarization, the message travels, the impulse travels down the axon, and it can travel down the axon because of this fatty white globby tissue right here called glial cells. The myelin sheath is what insulates the message. Think about those orange extension cords. What if you were to cut them open? Electricity would get out, right? That's what happens here. If the myelin breaks down, the static charge comes out. Right, so we'll get into the chain reaction tomorrow a little bit more, and we'll talk about specific molecules then.